I used to work as a cashier at Blockbuster. You know, the video rental place that went out of business a long time ago. A lot of people have fond memories of trips to Blockbuster. Everyone likes to say that there was something special about going there. Something about walking down the aisles on a Friday night, scouring the shelves for the perfect movie for the weekend. You couldn't plop down at your TV and have hundreds of movies at your fingertips like today. You had to get in the car and drive down to Blockbuster. But they can never pinpoint any solid reason as to why it was so great. I figure it's nostalgia rearing its head as it tends to do for people. Still, they speak so fondly of their experiences going there, as if it was something magical. I do remember being awed by the sheer amount of movies the first time I entered the store, but that memory has mostly faded away, replaced by sheer horror whenever I think back to my time there. The place still gives me nightmares. At the time I worked at Blockbuster, I was only 19 years old. I still lived with my parents, despite the ribbing I got from some of my buddies, who had packed their bags and headed off to different universities. Most of them flunked out anyway, but even if I would have flunked out too, I think I would have turned out better. I guess you could say that at the time, I was pretty unmotivated, lazy even. I didn't have much of a plan or an idea of what my future was going to be. I was taking it one day at a time, and trying to enjoy my life with my only real thoughts being which girl I would ask out, or where I could buy a bit of weed. My responsibilities at the time were to basically hold down a job, so I could have a bit of spending money. And so I ended up at Blockbuster as a cashier. It certainly wasn't a glamorous job, but there were worse places to work. I started out working a second shift with another guy. He was a bit older than me, but he was cool and he showed me the ropes. He taught me how to use the cash register, told me my duties, made sure everything was going alright. You know, just the usual stuff when you start a new job. It was all pretty simple stuff, and it didn't take long for me to become accustomed to working there. You had your bad customers, the guys who would get angry at you because the movie they wanted wasn't there, or the guy who didn't want to pay his late fees. But overall, most people were pleasant. The evenings were always pretty busy with people stopping by to pick up a movie after work. It was always lively, and to be honest, the time seemed to fly by. Most nights were a breeze with enough customers to pass the time without being overwhelmed. But Friday nights were almost always a hellish scramble trying to assist all the customers in a timely manner. It felt like half the town would converge on our local Blockbuster, hungry for movies to watch over the weekend. Families would pour in with their frenzied kids eager to rent some movies. I didn't really dislike kids until I saw the worst of them at Blockbuster. They would invariably scream or throw a tantrum when the movie or video game they wanted was out of stock. They always demanded candy or snacks, and none of them would leave the store happy unless they got 2 rentals, when their parents only wished to pay for 1. I had worked there for about 3 months when my manager, Mr. Evans, approached me about potentially moving to the graveyard shift. Mr. Evans told me that the typical night shift guy had quit, and that he was having a tough time filling the position. Since I was young and didn't have too many responsibilities, he of course thought that I was the perfect candidate. I wasn't especially keen on the idea, until he mentioned a nice pay raise. I couldn't resist even a little bit more money. Despite my reservations, I figured it would be a change of pace from the busy evenings and the terror of these screaming children. I had heard a few rumors of creepy customers coming in at night, and that gave me pause, but in the end, I decided that it wasn't worth worrying about and accepted the position. My first night on the graveyard shift, I was actually feeling a little nervous. The sun had gone down and I drove in the pitch dark of night to get to the usual shopping center. I had never seen the shopping center so dead. The parking lot was nearly empty at this hour, with most of these surrounding stores having closed about an hour earlier. I showed up about 5 minutes before my start time and found the vibe of the store completely different. The lively sounds of kids arguing over movies and people scrambling to get the newest releases were instead replaced with the quiet shuffling of the remaining customers as they walked out the door. It was a bit eerie to have the place so quiet, but I guess that's what I'd signed up for. Mr. Evans greeted me and explained he was going to be spending the first night with me. I felt a little relieved that I wasn't going to be alone, but also disappointed that it was going to be with the one person at the store I could barely stand. Mr. Evans was a bit of a hardo, who didn't like anyone having a spare moment to breathe. "You're not paid to stand around," was his favorite line. I'm sure most people know the type. He explained to me in a harsh tone that it's best to try to keep busy to keep the clock ticking. He suggested a list of menial tasks like taking inventory, or checking movies for signs of damage, or checking how many late movies there were so we could assess a fee. I say suggested, but even I could read between the lines that what he really meant was, have all that done before morning or you're going to hear about it. As my eyes were beginning to glaze over from the checklist of tasks he was sacking me with, he started walking towards the front of the store, waving his hand to signal me to follow. He led me behind the counter to where the cash register was before stopping and turning back towards me. He let out a brief sigh as if he didn't want to tell me what he was about to, but he had to get it over with. "Now, we've never had any problems here, but being that you are working at night, there is always a small chance that someone could try to rob the place. I'm not trying to scare you, and this is all in the very rare chance that it does happen." I nodded my head and listened intently as he continued to speak. I was wide awake now as he squatted down to look under the counter. I bent over to look under the counter as he pointed his finger at a small black button. "This button here is only to be pushed in an emergency. You can reach your hand under there and push it discreetly in case you need help. It will automatically send a signal to the police, and someone will be on their way," he said. I had never stopped to consider a robbery, and I had never been told about the button before. But I guess if I was to be alone, that I should know about it. Still, the idea of being held up at gunpoint didn't sit well with me, and I briefly asked myself if I had made the right choice taking the move to this new shift. Nevertheless, I nodded to the manager and told him that I understood, before he stood up with a grunt, holding a single hand on his lower back. He returned to showing me more ordinary tasks, and the rest of the night ended up going pretty quick. It took me about a week to settle into my new position. I had to get used to the typically barren store and the boredom that came with it. The music that repeated itself several times per night over the store's speaker system didn't help with making things any easier. I found myself fighting to stay awake, sometimes walking down the aisles in an attempt to keep myself energized. The worst thing was how creepy it felt at times to be alone in the store. With it being dark outside, I always found it a little scary. I wasn't a chicken or anything, but being the only building that is still open in the middle of the night felt strange. The store had a habit of creaking or groaning too. You couldn't hear these noises during the day, but in an empty store, they seemed as loud as fireworks. I would feel relief when I saw the sun coming up, and not only because my shift was ending. Even when I got used to the shift, I was always a little on edge. I would often hope that the door would open and a customer would walk in so I could be sure that there was still life outside of my small space at Blockbuster. I could pass some time assisting the customer, and often we would chit-chat about movies, but those situations were few and far between. I began to wonder if it was even profitable to have the place open at night, considering so few people showed up. I started to spend my time doing those menial tasks that Mr. Evans had given me. Occasionally, I would browse the vast collection of movies, to see if there were anything that I'd be interested in. It was only a job, I told myself. And so, the days passed. There eventually came a night where something really strange had happened. It was about 2 in the morning when a bald-headed man had walked into the store. As I said, I'm usually excited to see a customer, but this one was a bit different. Something about his head seemed odd. He was bald, but usually, you can see some hint of hair growing in somewhere. But this guy's head was completely bald, shining and everything. I could swear that his head was also a little too perfectly shaped. He was dressed in a gray jumpsuit with boots, which again I thought was odd. I chalked it up to him being some sort of maintenance man stopping in after one of his shifts. I greeted the man as he walked in, but he brushed past me and went down one of the aisles without a word. So much for being friendly, I thought to myself. I watched him carefully as he seemed to wander the store aimlessly. He did this for about 5 minutes, never seeming to stop to actually pick up a movie or even look at the cases. It was at this point that I was beginning to get a little weirded out. The little voice in the back of my head was telling me that something was amiss. I started to move, wanting to position myself behind the counter, just in case this guy was up to no good. But after about 15 minutes, the man continued to walk in a pattern around the store, down the horror section and then past the comedies and back up past the romance movies. I finally found the courage to speak up. This was all too weird for me. I came out from behind the counter and approached the man as he was doing his 7th lap past the comedies. "Sir, can I help you find anything?" I said with a meek voice. The man stopped in his tracks and I instantly had goosebumps. His head turned towards me this time, but slowly, almost robotically. His eyes were a dull gray color, but they looked almost glass-like. And his face again, it appeared a little too symmetrical, too perfect. There was a sort of sheen to the skin on his face. Something was not right with this guy. Call it gut instinct or a sixth sense, or whatever you like, but I had a bad feeling about him. He looked at me for a few seconds, those glassy eyes seemed to be scanning me, and then he turned around and continued walking. I didn't know what to do. I headed back behind the counter and pondered whether I should phone my manager or maybe even the cops. The man was freaking me out, but he hadn't actually done anything wrong. I don't think my manager would be too happy to be awoken in the middle of the night because a strange man was wandering the store. And so, I decided to do nothing, and by this point, the man had stopped walking and was now standing in the far corner facing a row of movies. I felt relieved for a moment, thinking that he would choose a movie and get out of here. But he didn't. He just stood there like a statue for about another 10 minutes. My heart was racing, unsure of what to do, when I heard the sound of the door opening to my left. I saw 2 men enter the store. Both were well-groomed and dressed in suits. One of them wore sunglasses, despite it being the middle of the night. The one man nodded at me, and I returned the gesture absent-mindedly. The night just got even weirder, I thought. The 2 men in suits headed directly for the bald-headed man who still stood in place. They both took position on opposite sides of the man, each grabbing one of his arms, and then began to drag him forcibly from the store. Was I witnessing a kidnapping? I didn't know what to think at that point. The bald-headed man didn't even scream or protest. He didn't even struggle. He only had a blank look on his face. I watched in silence as they dragged him out of the door and put him in a car. The whole thing was less than a minute. I once again pondered whether I should call the cops or someone. My heart was pounding after those events, but being a dumb teenager, I decided it was best to keep quiet. I finished out the rest of my night, but I was on edge, even more so than usual. Any creak or sound had me jumping, and I was even afraid of customers entering the building. I contemplated closing the store, getting into my car and leaving, but I didn't. I carried on with the next few nights as things returned to normal. I was beginning to feel less afraid, but I never told anyone about the strange man or the kidnapping, or whatever I saw. One night, Mr. Evans showed up out of the blue. He told me to do my normal duties, and that he would be sticking around to do paperwork in the back room. It was about halfway through my shift when I heard the door opening and a customer begin to walk in. My heart sank as I saw the same bald-headed man walk into the store. I immediately felt a tinge of fear creep into me, but I was reassured by the fact that my manager was in the back if I needed help. The man again began pacing around the place as I watched in silence. I didn't even try to greet him this time. I guess he had survived his kidnapping or whatever that was. He took the same exact route around the store as he did before, but after a few minutes, something must have changed. He stopped in place in the middle of the store and stood there with his back towards me. I was starting to feel creeped out again. I can't pinpoint what terrified me so much, but this guy was bizarre to say the least. His erratic movements and the way he would stop in place and stand there with no purpose to it left me feeling tense. I debated going back to get my manager, but then I saw something that horrified me even more. The back of the man's neck had what appeared to be a barcode on it. Was it some sort of tattoo? I didn't have time to really think about the implications of that, as the man turned and approached the counter. His movement had now transformed into a stilted, mechanical gait as he crept towards me. His dead eyes peered at me. His emotionless face revealed nothing of his intentions. It took everything I had to not run out of the building in that moment. "Hunger," the man said as he came ever closer to the counter. His voice was unnatural, too tinny, too high-pitched. Alarm bells were going off in my brain, telling me to get the heck out of there. But again, I didn't. I stood behind the counter until the man stood before me on the other side. Our eyes met for a moment, but I couldn't hold eye contact. Something about his eyes, they weren't right. I couldn't see any sense of human warmth within them. "Hunger," he repeated. I could only stutter out a short reply. "Well, we have some snacks that you can buy," I said, gesturing towards the shelf filled with candy and chips. A spark of nervousness was evident in my voice. "Hunger," he said again. At this point, I had had enough. I didn't stick around any longer than that. I ran out from behind the counter towards the back room to find my manager. The bald-headed man didn't move from his position. When I reached the back room, I found my manager going through a stack of papers. I was sweating at this point. My face was flushed. The manager looked at me as if I was crazy. "Is there a problem?" he asked. "There's a weird guy here. He keeps saying something about hunger. I tried to talk to him, but he only keeps saying how hungry he is." I spouted out. My manager shot me a peculiar grin and raised his eyebrow. "Guy's probably on drugs. I'll handle this," my manager said, getting up from his desk. For a few seconds, I felt relieved that I wouldn't have to deal with the man any longer. I followed Mr. Evans out of the room and towards the man. He was still standing at the counter repeating the word "hunger" every few seconds. Mr. Evans turned and gave me a look like he didn't believe it, as if to say, "What the heck," without actually saying those words. I could see a hint of concern in his eyes too now. I think we both instinctively knew that this was far from normal. We should have trusted our instincts and gotten the heck out of there, but instead, we tried to fulfill our job duties. "Sir, if you're hungry, there are plenty of snacks here you can purchase, and there's a diner down the street that is still open, and they make a great club sandwich," Mr. Evans said, trying to be cordial. He had that typical smile he had when dealing with customers. The man only stood still, repeating hunger over and over again. My manager stood there baffled, his smile slowly fading away into a scowl. Even he wasn't sure what to do at this point. "I'm gonna have to ask you to leave," Mr. Evans said sternly. But the man didn't move, only kept repeating the same word over and over. It was growing more rapid now. The pitch of his voice grew a little deeper, and it seemed to be more distorted each time he said it. I had positioned myself behind the counter once again. I had a feeling that this was going to go sideways, but hoped that Mr. Evans could take care of the situation. I could see his face going red now. He was going to explode. "Hey, did you not hear me? I said get the..." My manager didn't even get to finish his sentence when the bald-headed man grabbed his arms around the bicep and then squeezed. He began pushing his arms inward, pinning my manager's arms against his own body. Mr. Evans yelled and howled, struggling to escape the bald man's grasp, but he couldn't. I immediately pushed the black button. I knew the police would be on their way, but how long would that take? I didn't know whether to run from the building or try to help Mr. Evans escape. In the end, I stood rooted to the ground and watched in horror as the struggle continued. Everything seemed to be happening so fast, and I was powerless to do anything. The bald man began to open his mouth, but where a human would have a limit to how far they could open their mouth, this man apparently did not. His jaw began to stretch to inhuman levels as his face cracked and started to fall apart. Underneath was not red or muscle or bone, but some sort of gray synthetic material covered in a white foam. The thing's jaw continued to expand, growing larger and larger. What was once a human head had begun to fall apart as the thing's jaw grew. The nose cracked and it fell to the ground, followed by the thing's eyes. There were wet plopping sounds as pieces of skin and nose and its eyes fell to the ground. White foam began leaking onto the ground, filling the floor with the substance until it seemed it was up to their ankles. It bubbled and churned like it was undergoing some sort of chemical reaction. It smelled like some sort of cleaning chemical that made me want to pass out. My brain went blank, and I found that all I could do was scream at the horrific sight as the mouth of the thing grew ever larger. A massive black void with human-looking teeth dotting the outskirts. I screamed along with Mr. Evans, until our screams had begun to sound like a demented chorus. He was doing everything he could to escape, wriggling his body as best he could, swinging his head from side to side, trying to kick his legs, but it wasn't good enough. The thing had an ironclad grip on him. I began to pick up movie cases, candy, a small bell, anything that I could get my hands on. I lobbed the items at the thing from behind the counter, hoping that he would stop and release Mr. Evans. There was no effect. Even solid hits did not seem to faze him, and the terror continued. All the while, Mr. Evans did not seem to be able to hold on much longer. The thing's ears began to leak that same white foam as the mouth grew larger. Eventually, they fell to the floor. There was no longer a face. I wouldn't even call it a head anymore. It was now a collaboration of that strange material and a massive mouth, outlined by teeth ready to devour whatever it wished. I knew that I had to try to help in any way that I could. I didn't like Mr. Evans, but there was no way I was going to leave him to fight against this thing while I stood by and watched. I only had two options at that point. I could run out the door like a coward, or I could stand and help Mr. Evans. I chose the latter. I tried my best to mentally prepare myself for what I was going to do. My body trembled, but I mustered all the courage I had and I leaped over the counter to confront the monster. I charged towards the thing with a lion's roar, putting all my power into a shoulder slam. I connected with enough force that the thing staggered back a few feet, releasing its grip on Mr. Evans in the process. My shoulders stung from hitting him. Whatever material made up this thing, It was clearly tougher than any ordinary human body. To my dismay, the thing was able to remain on its feet. Its mouth head seemed to teeter back and forth as it recovered from the force of the impact. White foam gurgled out of the gigantic mouth as it turned its attention towards me. Mr. Evans had fallen to the ground, and he was clearly injured in some way. He clutched at his ribs as if in extreme pain, but still, he tried to crawl across the floor towards the door. I thought that I could buy him some more time if I hit the thing again. I charged at the monster again, intending to tackle him to the floor. When I reached the thing and my body made contact with it, it was like I had run into a steel wall. Pain shot through my shoulder and down through my body. The thing didn't budge this time, not even an inch. The adrenaline that I had a moment ago had completely dissipated, and it was instead replaced by extreme fear. I tried to turn and run, but his hand reached out towards me and wrapped around my neck. It was hard to breathe almost immediately. The pressure on my throat tightened, and I was gasping for the tiniest bit of air. I swung one of my arms in a frantic play to try to free myself, but this was a huge mistake. I realized almost as soon as I had swung that this was not a great idea, but when you're in a panic, you do dumb things. Everything was in slow motion as I saw the thing's mouth head shift into place, so that a good part of my arm sank right into the thing's mouth. There was nothing left I could do at that point. I tried to scream, but I couldn't. I felt a sharp pain in my arm as its teeth sank down into my flesh, piercing through muscle and then through my bone. When I pulled my arm back, I was missing most of it. What remained in my arm was a horrific stump that spurted red. I felt my vision blackening as I saw it. I couldn't breathe. I began to tell myself that this was the end. That was when the thing suddenly tossed me like a rag doll into one of these central display shelves. I felt the back of my head hit a part of the metal shelf as well as the large part of my back. The shelf tipped over as I went along with it, crashing to the floor with a heavy thud. Movie cases fell to the ground along with me, and I could see red begin to pool around the floor. Red filled my left eye as I realized my head was now bleeding as well. I could barely move my body at this point. My back had been injured and it hurt to move. I clutched at what remained of my arm, trying my best to stifle the intense bleeding. I saw stars for a moment, but I was able to regain my breath and look over to see the thing heading for Mr. Evans again, who had not made it too far. The only thought that ran through my head at the moment was, you tried, as the thing picked up Mr. Evans once again, and resumed what I had interrupted. I was completely defeated. Mr. Evans shrieked as the thing pulled him up off the ground. It began to squeeze his arms into his body the same way that it had before. I could see through my hazy vision that Mr. Evans looked over at me in a desperate plea for some sort of help. But no one could help us at this point, and I heard the bones in his arms finally give way with a loud, cracking sound. The thing continued to push his arms inward, and Mr. Evans let out one last howl before I heard the final cracking of his ribs too. I saw red begin to trickle to the floor as a part of his bone had pierced flesh. The red mixed with the white foamed to form a visceral soup. Mr. Evans' torso was being crushed even further by the immense strength of this thing. Red skin and yellowed fat fell to the floor as the ribs began to move through the flesh. I felt so lightheaded, and even though I'm certain this all took place in under a minute, it felt like a nightmare that had no end. I could only remain motionless and hope that the police would arrive soon. I could see tears well in Mr. Evans' eyes as the large mouth slowly loomed over his head. White foam dripped onto Mr. Evans' head, and his teary eyes transformed into the frantic eyes of a dying animal before they were obscured by the mouth that was beginning to engulf his head. The muffled scream still came through, and then with one rapid movement the mouth closed, the teeth slamming down onto Mr. Evans' neck and then shaking him back and forth like a dog does with a chew toy. I heard the snapping of his neck, and the tearing of flesh and muscle before I saw Mr. Evans' body separate from his head. His lifeless form fell to the ground, more red where his head used to be. Bits of matter dripped from the mouth of the thing to join the soup on the floor. I laid on top of the metal shelf, my body racked with extreme pain. I felt so weak, close to death. I couldn't stop shaking, couldn't control my bodily functions. I had witnessed what had happened to Mr. Evans by something that I still can't explain, and now I feared it was going to come finish me off. It lumbered over towards me. I could see the darkness of its gigantic mouth, its teeth stained red. But as I laid there waiting for my end, the thing instead had decided to begin pacing around the store. I lost sight of it at times as it moved behind me somewhere, but it would always reappear as it skulked around the store. I could hear the footsteps of the thing as it trudged through the store. Each footstep reverberated in my brain as my body screamed out in agony. Eventually the door opened, and I heard two sets of footsteps enter the building. It was the two men from earlier. They wore suits and looked like some sort of agent. I remember crying out for help, but I'm not sure if anything even came out. "Oh, come on," one man yelled almost immediately upon seeing the body of Mr. Evans, but he didn't move from his spot. I wasn't sure what was going on anymore. I could hear the thing still pacing around the store somewhere behind me. The man wearing these sunglasses looked in my direction. It seemed that he had summed me up, but was completely indifferent to my plight. I heard a beeping sound as a man held down a button on a small handheld radio. "Appears the subject has ate a man. Got another one here that is injured pretty bad. Bile skin has eroded almost completely. How do we proceed?" There was a brief pause and a crackling sound came through the radio. "Retrieve the subject and we'll take care of things on our end. How much did it eat this time?" "One guy is missing a head, not a pretty sight. Another guy is still alive, but he lost his arm it seems," the man responded. The radio had beeped again. "Roger, we'll work on it." The response crackled over the radio. A flash of anger crossed the man's face. "Yeah, you'll work on it, we've heard that before. Why the heck do you keep sending these things out to interact with people? You could at least test it with animals, or better yet, test the things with dummies so we don't have to constantly clean up your mess," the man responded. The radio crackled once more. "Do I need to remind you who signs your paycheck? Quit your bickering. The testing process will take some time and some sacrifice. Things aren't like comic books. You don't just inject some serum and get a functional super soldier. We'll iron things out on our end. You only need to worry about your job." There was a pause before the radio crackled again. "You said there was a survivor there." "Yeah, the kid looks like he's in terrible shape. Probably only has a few minutes left. Should we finish the job?" My body tensed as I heard them say that. I wanted to get up and run, but I couldn't. I was too weak. I had lost a ton of fluid, and my vision was doubling and then blackening. The room seemed to swirl. Once more, the radio crackled to life. "Don't bother, it'd be harder to explain the bullets. Sounds like he's on his way out anyway," the man said. I heard the two men march through the store, and then heard the dull sound of dragging as they pulled the thing from the building. "These things are never going to work," I heard one of the men say as they dragged the thing away. I heard a car door slam, and then I heard the car speed off out of the parking lot. My vision spun once more as I listened to the faint music playing through the store speakers. I looked over what was left of Mr. Evans' body. His arms were shattered. Bits of bone protruded from the skin. And his torso. God, his torso was crushed to be about half the size of what it should be. His ribs had totally collapsed. I winced painfully, trying not to look at the area where his head should be. But some sights you can't avoid seeing, and I'll never forget that image. I laid my head back on the ground and whispered to myself. I tried, before everything faded to black. I awoke sometime later in a dull gray room with curtains drawn to my right. I heard the beeping of machines and the footsteps of staff walking the hallways outside. I deduced that I was in the hospital. I was groggy, still trying to process and remember what had happened to me. Every part of my body seemed to have an ache or a pain to it. I groaned as my head throbbed. I could see that they had bandaged up my stump, and for a few seconds, I felt terror as the realization hit me again that I was missing an arm. I moved my stump back and forth, not really believing it, but slowly I came to remember and accept what had happened to me. The rest of my time at the hospital was fairly mundane as I recovered. Nurses would change my bandages, bathe me, give me painkillers, and every now and then the doctor would stop in to check up on me. They told me that I was going to be alright despite losing my arm. And they were right. At least physically, I was going to be okay. But the trauma of the event had stung me deeply. I say that the recovery was mundane, but there was one peculiar incident that sticks out. There was a day that a strange doctor had walked into my room after one of my physical therapy sessions. He was odd looking, dark circles under his eyes, unkempt hair. I had been seeing two different doctors who I had become familiar with, but this guy was new. He didn't have the usual ID badge clipped to his coat that every other doctor in the hospital had. He carried a small cup in his hand, filled with some mysterious liquid. He introduced himself as Dr. Matthews, and proceeded to tell me that he was sent to give me my medicine before handing me the cup of liquid and then watching me intensely. I thought it was strange considering that I already took my typical medication about an hour earlier. Go on now, drink up. I looked down at the cup. The liquid was a nasty green color, and it had a strange chemical smell to it. I didn't feel good about drinking it or this new doctor. Well, what is it? I asked. It's for your recovery. They told me to bring it to you, he said before resuming his intense staring. I was feeling leery about this guy. His gaze fixated on the cup in my hand, and he stared with an intensity that frightened me. As I was pondering what to say or do, one of my regular nurses walked into the room. She eyed up the doctor for a second. Excuse me, who are you? The nurse asked. The man babbled out something about being a consultant for another doctor and that he was only there to bring me my medicine. For these same reasons as me, she didn't seem to buy this, and with a sharp tongue told the man to get out before calling security. The man shuffled out of the room with haste after that. I don't know what happened after that or any of the details about the guy. The nurse took the medicine away from me, and that was the last that I heard of the incident. I went through a long depression after my release from the hospital. My life was irrevocably changed with the loss of my arm, and I was haunted for a long time by the death of Mr. Evans. I feel like I could have done more to help him, to help us escape from that nightmarish thing. I replayed the situation all the time in my head. I still have the image of his lifeless body drilled into my brain. I ended up moving across the country shortly after my recovery. I needed some sort of positive change, and thought that that would be the trick. The Blockbuster that I worked at never reopened after the incident. In fact, there was very little talk of the incident at all. No real news articles. Even the police seemed disinterested in pursuing justice. They had questioned me about what had happened, but in the end, I don't think they ever really caught the thing or the man involved with it. I've thought a lot about what that thing was, and the only explanation I can muster is that it was some sort of freak experiment set loose on us. I don't know who was behind it. The government, some secret agency, a strange cult. I don't know, but I don't think they wanted me to know about it. I've spent a lot of time looking over my shoulder, and I have the perpetual feeling of being followed. There was the false doctor, and lately I've had cars tailing me suspiciously long. Last week, a weird van was parked outside of my house, and I saw people that I've never seen before walking these sidewalks in my tiny neighborhood. I've never told anyone this story before, but because of these events, I feel like I have to. This event completely and irreversibly ruined my life. I'm scared to go out, scared to do much of anything. I have no idea what the heck that thing was, but I can still hear it. The high-pitched, tinny voice repeating, "Hunger," plays again and again in my head. But the thing that truly scares me the most is the fact that it was created over 20 years ago. Think of how much technology has advanced in that time. If they created that thing over 20 years ago, I can only shudder when I think of what they can create today.